Hello everyone, and welcome to Dutch Greybeard. The main reason why I don't do many top 10 or top 25 videos is because I'm relatively new to fantasy. For the time being, I believe it is appropriate that I back down a bit on listing books before I've read a good deal more books in this amazing genre. I did one top 10 video of best fantasy series, which to be honest felt a little bit presumptuous, but I did it anyway. Just as I'm now doing a top 10 of my best fantasy books. When I started this completely unexpected journey into the world of fantasy, I'd read about 40 books that could be regarded as fantasy, which is not a lot considering I'd read a couple of thousand books in other genres at that point in time. Most of these books I read too long ago to remember much about them. Now, 20 months later, I have read 75 fantasy books in addition to that, 8 of which probably belong to the science fiction genre. I've read a bit more science fiction with authors such as Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein and Arthur C. Clarke. I'll try to focus on fantasy for this list, although at times genres overlap, and I find it limiting to put books inside a genre box too strictly. Like there must be 100 or more subgenres within fantasy. That is just fine with me. I only don't want it to distract me too much from the books themselves and their content. Anyway, with more than 100 books under my belt, I believe it is okay for me to do a top 10 of them by now. To be able to make my top 10 of series, I had to let the books I read long ago participate. Now for this top 10 of books, I will only include the books I've read since January of 2023, my official starting point of this journey into fantasy. Some of the other books I read back in 1982 and some later, and have never reread them after that. I was 18 years old at the time, so many of those books I do not remember very much of. I'm rereading a couple of those on audio, but I'm extremely slow at this. At this moment, I'm still listening to the third book in the Dungeon Chronicles trilogy by William Horwood. I started listening this one in February this year. Still, after that I intend to listen to Tolkien's creation, starting with The Hobbit. Just 2 ground rules for my selection of the best fantasy books. I can pick only one book per author and, as mentioned, the book has to be read after December 2022. Beforehand, I want to mention 3 of the books I read a long time ago. You may call them honourable mentions. I may not remember the details of them very well, but I do remember enjoying them tremendously. They are Winter, which is the 4th and final book in the Hidden World series by William Horwood. Expect a separate video on this quadrilogy anytime soon. The other is The Amber Spyglass, the concluding book in His Dark Materials, a trilogy by Philip Pullman. And, of course, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This book, which I still regard as one book, I first read in Dutch many years ago, and later on I read it in English several times. Obviously, it had to at least be mentioned in my first top 10 of fantasy books. So, with all the bookkeeping out of the way, let's start with my number 10, The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. I was very much impressed by Scott Lynch's condensed and inventive language. His descriptions of how people look, or the fast-paced and witty dialogues, were all language candy to me. The only thing is that practically every character talks this way. No one really distinguishes him or herself in the way they talk. I also found that our main character, Loch Lamora, remained rather bland and foggy for a long time. Another element I enjoyed is the banter. Not as good as what Hadrian and Royce display in Michael J. Sullivan's Rieria Revelations, but very funny at times. Also, the world building deserves praise, and I'm sure this will expand in the other books in this series. This book alone gave me this rich feeling that there is a huge and largely unexplored world waiting to be discovered. The story is very good and entertaining, although the finale was perhaps a little bit over the top. The way this book is composed with flashbacks also appealed to me. So yeah, a very good book that I would easily recommend to anyone who doesn't shy away from a little bit of violence and grossness. I do have a feeling, however, that in my next edition of this top 10, The Lies of Locke Lamora will probably have moved to the honourable mention section. Number 9. Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey. If you're interested in a more extensive reading experience on the first two trilogies in the legendary Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, check out the 2 videos I made earlier. By far my favourite of these 6 books is Dragon Song, which is the first book in the so-called Harper Hall trilogy. Here's an overview of how I rated all 6 books. My next best in this series, the first book, Dragonflight, scored 7 points lower. The Harper Hall books are short and fun reads. I was very pleasantly surprised to read about how Meneley goes from a repressed and misunderstood girl in a fisher's community to someone who finally gets all the praise she deserves for her many talents. It is a beautiful coming-of-age story where the author not once put up smokescreens for the readers. Everything was very easy to understand, and stuff that hadn't really been explained in the other books suddenly is clarified. Even though the story is rather predictable, it is highly enchanting. Number 8. The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin. I belong to the aficionados of the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, although I can see why people are less positive about these books. They require some stamina and perseverance of readers, but as with many books that don't leave the doors wide open, once you've crossed that threshold, you'll be rewarded tenfold. To me, the concluding volume, The Stone Sky, was the best, although in points the 3 books are not very far apart from each other. The prose is phenomenally artful. Her language is very well cared for, and it transports me straight away to this particular world where cataclysmic events take place every so many hundred years. This world is extremely bleak. Only people who think they have a future fear death. On its own, this is quite a profound observation, but within the Broken Earth, where people try to survive in the harshest of conditions without any real hope for improvement even in the longer future, you will find that people who believe they have a future are scarce. The second person narrative, which is only used in the chapters of Essun, the main character, certainly required some getting used to. But once you're over that initial threshold, it becomes intriguing. Obviously, the author has very good reason to choose for such an unusual POV. These books are literary fiction disguised as fantasy. Even though a reader cannot sit back, relax and enjoy the read or write, it is well worth the effort. Number 7. Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. As with the Broken Earth trilogy, I rated the books in the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb very close to each other. But, as it should be, the final book in the series was the best. My first meeting, as a reader of course, with Robin Hobb was very successful. The character journey Fitz Farseer goes through is amazing. From this young boy to this kingly hero, with all his flaws, his doubts, and his hardship, is extremely well portrayed. The emotions Hobb's characters experience are real in all their nakedness. For instance, when Fitz is reminded of the way he was tortured in Book 2 by Regal's thugs, he is not angry. I felt shamed at what Regal had done to me. That is real. The last part of Assassin's Quest is one huge march towards an epic finale, and the book contains many heart-gripping scenes and dialogues. And her closing sentence of each of the novels in this trilogy is simply genius. After many hundred pages, Hobb manages to capture an entire world in just a few words. I haven't seen another fantasy author top this, as of yet. Number 6. The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. This closing volume of the first Mistborn series, also known as Era 1, is by far the best book in the trilogy. All the small things like the voices inside people's head, the strangeness of the Kandra and the Kolos, how the Inquisitors operate and where they fit in, everything gets resolved in a very satisfying way. Brandon Sanderson has won me over completely with The Hero of Ages. Against the background of a dying world, several storylines march towards the epic ending. There are revelations at almost every corner and signpost in the book. And the smallest thing, like a seemingly insignificant metal earring, can turn out to be decisive in the end. It is so well plotted. Even though the very ending may be a bit pompous and sad, I enjoyed it nonetheless very much. I was most impressed by Sazed's struggle with his faith and his frantic search for a religion that makes sense or is true. Also, this storyline is resolved beautifully in the end. Number 5. Duntonwood by William Hallwood. This is the only book that initially belonged to my older reads, but I reread it on audio in 2023, so it may compete in this top 10. In my top 10 fantasy series, the Duncton Chronicles, of which Duntonwood is the first book, holds the number 1 spot. I have to admit that a huge truckload of nostalgia played a part in that ranking. The book was as good as I remembered it, which is why I rated it 98 points out of 100, but other titles have superseded it by now. As with all the other books on this list, I will put a link in the description box below so that people who are interested can view the video dedicated to this book. I've talked about this book and its author in length on this channel. It was my first experience listening to a book instead of physically reading it. It took me almost 2 months, and at the moment I'm listening to the third book of this series, I'm even much slower. Maybe audio simply isn't my thing. Hallwood's novel unravels a threefold quest: the journey across the land, the journey in the mind, and the journey toward the end of life. His writing style is very picturesque and he doesn't hold back on describing nature. He creates atmospheric images that instantly transport the reader to the woods the moles inhabit. He also doesn't shy away from strong emotions. The characters are multidimensional, and even though the good and the bad are easily recognizable, both good and bad have opposite streaks as well. The end of this novel is overwhelmingly sad, beautiful, profound, but above all, hopeful. Even though this book was published back in 1980, and this shows in the narration at points, I still highly recommend it for all readers, and this audio version is a very accessible form. Number 4. Heir of Novron by Michael J. Sullivan. When I started on this journey into fantasy, it was the second week into January 2023. It wasn't very long before I discovered BookTube. At that point in time, I still wrote down my reading experiences. It wasn't until April of that year that I started my own channel. And for the 3 books of Michael J. Sullivan's Rhaeria Revelations, I wrote a disappointingly short reading experience at the time. Thankfully, I remember the series and its final volume very well. The way I experience a book can change over time. Thinking back on it, my appreciation may change for better or worse. In the case of Heir of Novron, the book has gotten better and better in my memory. The banter between Royce and Hadrian is the best I've yet come across in fantasy, and the story is masterfully told. The character work is superbly done, especially in the case of Princess Arista, who, during the trilogy, transforms from the spoiled girl of noble birth into a wise, loving and courageous sorceress. And the most lovable character in all of fantasy has to be Myron, the monk. He is a textbook example of how wisdom and naivety go hand in hand. The final pages of Heir of Novron firmly established my reverence for this author. Number 3, Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. In my spoiler-filled video on this book, I called it small in size but huge in impact. This was an astonishing read, one that I think back on regularly. Not only is the book set in a maze, the plot of the book is a maze on its own. And with each page the reader advances and can see around another corner. Apart from one or two minor, less realistic aspects, this small novel is near to perfect. It explores the concept of truth because, as I advanced into the story, everything our main character, who is called Piranesi, had believed to be true turns out to be something different entirely. What I love is how completely innocent and naive Piranesi is and how inherently good his nature is. Even after we find out the story behind Piranesi's highly surrealistic existence, he remains to be kind. I am in awe of Susanna Clarke's craftsmanship and her rich and profound imagination. Piranesi is still a serious contender for my Book of the Year 2024. Number 2, The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan. This book, which I read at the start of my journey into fantasy, is my favourite of all the Wheel of Time books. While reading this huge and hugely popular series, I realised that I was undergoing an initiation, a rebirth into this genre of fantasy. I started reading this series with Newspring, the prequel Robert Jordan published in 2004. The Eye of the World, the first in the series, was great, but with The Great Hunt, I really felt being dragged into a first-time experience. I've said it several times on this channel already, but I'll say it again, how the whole concept of the Wheel of Time weaving threads is my main attraction in these books. Taveren is further explained in this book, and the way the Aes Sedai talk about the turning of the wheel is so meaningful. At times it's almost as if the meaning of life is about to be revealed. This series will always hold a special place in my memory, with this book in particular. Number 1, Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. This is the best fantasy book I have read so far. I rated it 99 points out of 100, just like The Great Hunt, but overall I enjoyed GGK's prose more. The story is set on the Palm, a peninsula with 9 different countries or city-states. This world in early Renaissance time reminded me of the Italian Tuscany and at times also of the Languedoc in the south of France. We follow a group of characters who try to undo a great wrong that was done to their city, Tigana, and ultimately rid the Palm of 2 tyrants. This novel bursts with poetic prose and wisdom of an extremely high level. Strangely enough, the story itself may be the least astonishing element of this book, although it is strong and emotional. My appreciation lies for the most part in the way it is told, with all its complexity, turns, twists, heartbreak, love, and so on. All the characters are layered. They are believable and sophisticated, with a special mention of the beautiful and enigmatic Dianora. She is one of the most conflicted characters in this book. There is so much to say about this excellent book, and some of it I said in my separate video. During this read, I was only halfway through the book. I bought 9 more books by this author. I've read another 3 of those by now and cannot wait to continue on in Kay's oeuvre. If you are sensitive to beautiful prose, a complex story in an epic fantasy world that reads easily, you should definitely check out Tigana. So, those are my 10 favourite fantasy books. What are your thoughts on the books I've mentioned? Did you like them as well, or not at all, or something in between? please leave a note for me in the comments. That is always rewarding for me. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until we meet again at Dutch Greybeard.